Hello, cruel world. So, Ghislaine Maxwell, who's age 60, has very recently just been sentenced to 20 years in a US prison. She's been found guilty of trafficking 4 teenage girls while she was Epstein's boyfriend. And this all happened between 1994 to 2004. The judge said that her actions were, and I quote, heinous and predatory. On top of all that, she faces a fine of $750,000, although I don't think that's a big problem for her. So, how will Maxwell be treated when she's in prison? What are the kind of factors or the effects of her being high profile and famous? Does that make a difference? How will she cope? Will she be institutionalized? Might her mental health be affected? And if so, will she need to go to hospital? Plus, what are my thoughts on the risk of her reoffending in the future? I will answer all of those questions and many, many more in this episode of A Psych for Sore Minds. My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. You can call me the ominous Shahamless. Let's get started. So, how will Maxwell be treated in prison? As you probably know, there tends to be a hierarchy amongst criminals. This is more prevalent in the male prison estate than the female prison estate. So, for example, men who commit domestic violence or sex offences, particularly against children, are at the bottom of the hierarchy. In some high secure prisons in the States, they are KOS, kill on sight. And there's lots of people who are like newly joined to prison gangs who want to work on their reputation, so they're more than happy to dish out a bit of criminal justice. This doesn't happen quite as much in the female prisons, but it happens a bit more in the US than it does in the UK. So I think it's very feasible that this is what will happen to Maxwell. I suppose it depends on the environment, depends on the gangs, etc., etc. Plus, crucially, she's a very high-profile case. Why does that matter? It means that everybody knows who she is and what she's done. So there will be some people, some women in the prison who will want to make a name for themselves. They will get this like respect, this kudos, this notoriety if they beat her up. Just kind of going in a bit of a obtuse angle, I remember when I read Mike Tyson's autobiography, fascinating read, shout out to Mike, that when he went to prison, lots of men tried to attack him, tried to fight him to build up their rep. So the point I'm making is if they've got the balls to attack Mike Tyson, then I'm sure there must be somebody in the female prison system in America who would want to attack Maxwell. Having said all that, it's possible that because she's so rich, she could get protection. So if her people on the outside pay some of the female gang members or prisoners in the prison on a regular basis, they might actually protect her. Having said all that, I think that given the level of her offending, sex trafficking, etc., the moral code of prisoners will probably be more important. So I think it's more likely that she'll be a target rather than being protected. Now, of course, because of the nature of her crimes, because of her notoriety, they could put her in protective custodies, which is where they put like sex offenders, especially considering what had happened to Epstein, who committed suicide in prison. Not really, but allegedly committed suicide in prison. So there's already a lot of attention. So if she was to be attacked, it's just not a good look for the prison. So even though they might not necessarily care about her as an individual, it will be in their interest to try and protect her. They don't want news leaking out of her being assaulted on a regular basis. Having said all of that, she's in prison for 20 years. That is a long period of time, and I'm sure that some of the non-protected prisoners will have access to her at some point in 20 years. It's inevitable. Okay, next question. How will Maxwell cope with this 20-year stretch? So instead of thinking generally, let's think specifically about Maxwell, right? We know that she's entitled, she's very egotistical, she's narcissistic, she lacks empathy. She kind of has this haughty vibe of looking down on others and being sort of privileged. Privileged is the word I'm looking for. So I've seen prisoners from the time that I've worked as a psychiatrist in prisons, including female prisons, especially female prisoners, who have this like harsh reality in the community outside of prison. They might be regularly exposed to violence, and women especially might be victims. There might be pimps out there, abusive partners. There might be a whole world of temptation, drugs and alcohol, poverty, homelessness. So the reason I'm mentioning all of that is because for them, prison is not so bad. It might sound like a contradictory thing to say, but I've met numerous prisoners that I've talked to who've said that they've enjoyed the structure, the safety, the certainty, the routine of being in prison. But Maxwell is the opposite of all of those things. As I said, she's privileged, she's entitled. So I think she's going to find it really hard to adjust. However, she's there for 20 years, and that is a very, very long time for anybody to adjust to anything. So I think she will adjust eventually, probably about a year or two down the line. Okay, so what about her mental health? I mean, do you even care, viewers, about her mental health? Let me know in the section below. If she was to become depressed, for example, she still can see a psychiatrist. So there are resources to look after prisoners' mental health. In fact, I used to be in a mental health in-reach team as a psychiatrist in the past, but I'd be the first to admit that it's a substandard, poorer service compared to in the community. There's a massive lack of resources. These mental health teams are massively overstretched. They're overburdened with loads of prisoners that need help. So because of that, there are delays for weeks, sometimes months, even just to get an appointment. Okay, so what about Maxwell's risk of suicide? So if you see my previous video, which I urge you to go check, always be plugging, then you will see that she was put into protective custody, or she's put into a special part of the prison because of her supposed risk of suicide, which she denies, her lawyers deny is a realistic issue. But I think now that sentencing has happened, then it's very possible that she could be suicidal, at least in the short term. Because think about it, she's fallen such a long way compared to the average prisoner. She was living the high life, she was extremely rich, a minor celebrity, she was going out with a multi-millionaire. She's gone all the way from that all the way to being a target, scum of the earth, lowest of the low. At least that's how she's viewed by prisoners. So she's fallen such a long way. I think it's possible that suicide might be on her mind. Plus, her lawyers were pushing for a 5-year or less sentence. She got 20 years. So from her perspective, it's a really bad outcome. So all of these would be factors that might increase her risk of suicide. So what does it matter? What if she was suicidal, if she was self-harming, what would happen? So all prisons have these safeguards. So in the UK, there's the ACCT, Acute Care in Custody Teamwork. I missed out the T from my last video. It's in my mind now. Americans don't have exactly the same system, but they've got something similar. So people who are women or men in prison who are thought to be at high risk of suicide will have like an extra level of observations. They will go to a special housing unit where they can be observed, which is away from the hustle, bustle, the turmoil, the violence of the main prison wings. It would be extremely rare, very unlikely that Maxwell will be sent to prison, transferred to hospital, to a psychiatric hospital, because prisons are expected to deal with self-harm. They don't deal with it particularly well in my experience for numbers of reasons that I won't go into, but it's really rare for people to go to hospital, even if they're acutely suicidal. For example, if somebody became so depressed that they actually became psychotic, so they were hearing voices, not eating, for example, having these nihilistic delusions about not existing, which is very common in psychotic delusion, in psychotic depression, then there is a chance, if they're not taking the medication, that they might be transferred to prison. But I'm talking about a very, very small proportion of prisoners, plus all of those symptoms have to be elicited. They have to be proven. She has to be assessed by a forensic psychiatrist, such as myself. Just going to turn the page. Sorry to ruin the illusion then. Okay, so next question. What do I think of Maxwell's risk of reoffending? I actually think that she's a low risk of reoffending in the future, and I will tell you why. But first, I'm going to introduce you to this channel. Welcome to A Psych for Sore Minds. This is a smorgasbord of videos of topics related to true crime with a little sprinkling of psychiatry. If you're interested in these kind of high-profile cases, I've done a video on Jimmy Savile. I've diagnosed Amber Heard and her diagnoses, borderline histrionic personality disorder. I've even very recently recorded a video with my mate, Steve Wraith, who was actually friends with Ronnie Kray and Charlie Bronson. He met them on several occasions, so I interviewed him talking about those experiences. My intention for all these videos is to educate you, dear viewers, so you can start thinking like a forensic psychiatrist. Also, I kind of want to take over the world, but we'll come back to that. Okay, so I said before that I think that Maxwell is actually at low risk of reoffending. Why have I said that? I don't think for a second that despite what she said, her crocodile tears during the court case, that she's had an epiphany or she's totally changed her moral compass. I don't think she's found God. It's not because I think she'll denounce the devil. I think it's simply circumstances. So she will be 80 years old when she's released. Just to put the whole circumstances thing into perspective, and very quickly, just for 1 minute, going to go on a tangent and tell you about a prisoner that I personally assessed in my career who had shot his wife dead. He was a farmer. and he tried to commit suicide immediately afterwards with a shotgun. He blew off the bottom of his jaw, had reconstructive surgery, survived, ended up being paraplegic and in a wheelchair. Now, he's on a life sentence, which Maxwell is not, and his tariff, I believe, was 32 years. So that means when that time's up, him and his defense team have to prove that he's decreased risk. And I think in his specific circumstance, it's really easy to prove that, despite how heinous his crimes were, because he's literally paraplegic in a wheelchair. So his ability to commit violence, his risk is lowered. So I've actually talked about this in my book, In Two Minds. You've got to go cop it. It's my professional memoirs and my most fascinating and gruesome cases. Yes, I'm low-key trying to sneak in a little promo for my book. But why am I mentioning him? Because sometimes specific circumstances themselves makes the risk of reoffending lowered. So Maxwell, as I said, will be 80, which I think is too old for most people to offend. But more importantly, she'll be too well known. Even though 20 years would have passed, what happened was so shocking. It was so embedded in the public consciousness that people will remember. So I think that she won't be able to commit things like sex trafficking because it's that sort of offence is too open, it's too obvious. You need some sort of structure. It's not something that you can hide or do subtly. I mean, you can hide it from the authorities, but the whole social circle, the whole social strata where that's occurring will know what's going on. So I guess what I'm saying is that people will disassociate themselves with Maxwell. I think they've already started doing that. So even creepy men, in fact, especially creepy men, will want to keep their distance from her because it will draw attention to them, and their nefarious activities might be easily discovered if they're connected to her. Plus, if she spent the last 20 years in prison, she won't have the network, the access to these vulnerable victims that she once had. So I think for all of those reasons, she would be low risk of reoffending compared to, for example, a violent offender, somebody who regularly assaults people, or a sex offender, because they are opportunistic kind of crimes. They can just suddenly be done impulsively, and then the defender can flee or try and hide, whereas you need an entire structure in place, which is much harder to hide for sex trafficking. Okay, so those are my thoughts on this case. To conclude, I hope I've given you a bit of an insight from the perspective of a forensic psychiatrist working in prison. Hope I've let you in on what I think about this case, specifically about how Maxwell will be treated in prison and her mental health kind of potential issues. Hope it's been educational, but I want to know what you think, dear viewers. Do you agree with me? Do you agree with what I'm saying about how she'll be treated? Do you care about her mental health? Do you think she'll cope in the same way? Crucially, do you agree with my propositions about her risk of reoffending, or am I talking bullcrap? Let me know in the schmection below. That's all I have to say. Have a blessed day. Stay euthymic. Watch my videos. Buy my goddamn book. I love you.